My background, my pre-2020 background, I should say, is in education. I live in the Chicago area. I have a PhD in educational psychology from the University of Virginia, and I spent a 20-year career working in schools, first as a teacher, middle school teacher, but then really as a teacher of teachers. I worked with schools in a lot of different ways, did a lot of different kinds of consulting, a lot of it teaching teachers how to teach better is the simple way to put it. But I did some program evaluation and analysis and other kinds of work as well. Taught some online classes simultaneously for UVA. Did a lot of conferences and things like that. Wrote several books, book chapters, articles. So that was all pre 2020, and 2020 changed a lot of that for me. But I had a good run. I had a really good 20-year career in education.
What changed?
Well, in case you didn't know,
was there something that happened?
Yes, March 2020, the human rights heist of March 2020, I call it. War was declared by numerous countries and the WHO against the populace of the world, and we were told that there was a silently spreading threat that was coming from China to a country near you, and that we needed to shut down. So at least in my country, the order to do that came around. It depends when you mark it from, but the national emergency was declared on March 13th. And then on March 16th, President Trump said 15 days to slow the spread. Right? Like we're running a drill. Okay, everybody, 15 days to slow the spread. And things shut down. Schools closed, churches closed. That was crazy. I've never seen anything like that insofar as churches and houses of worship, obedience. And life as we knew it just completely disrupted, and people said okay. But I will say that a lot of people thought it was only going to be 2 weeks. In retrospect, I realize, and you probably do too, that it was never going to be 2 weeks. It was never, ever going to be 2 weeks. That was not the plan. And a lot of things changed for me and millions, if not billions, of people around the world. So
somebody asked me the other day if I would like to go back to the pre-2020 era. And after thinking about it, I actually wouldn't.
Why not?
I feel more enlightened now, don't you?
Yes, but I lost a lot, and you probably did too. I don't know your entire backstory, but I lost a lot, and I think that's important because some people lost very little. Some people are way better off now than they were in 2019 because of 2020. Now, let me say, I'm not in a disadvantaged position. I'm not. So many people, their lives were completely disrupted, and economically, professionally, brought them to the bottom. We have kind of a buffer in our situation, but it was very hard and very, very hard for my kids. And I don't know if I would. That's a tough question for me. Would I go back to 2019? It's very hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think about my own family now and vaccines, my child and my view on vaccines and my view on pandemics and all that, I think I feel like I'm in a much better intellectual space.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I know things now that I didn't know then, that I'm glad that I know. I just wish it wouldn't have taken that for me to know them.
Yeah.
I think that's more what it is. And we don't have to talk about this, but even things like, the moon, right? Did we land on the moon? That's my favorite question to ask at dinner, when you're out with people, be like, so why haven't we gone back to the moon?
But that right there, I think that right there epitomizes the COVID era. So you start off by talking about whether or not there was a pandemic, and you end up talking about the moon landing.
I go the other way around. See, that's the strategy. The strategy is that if you bring up, like, why haven't we gone back to the moon? Then someone will be like, back? Do you think we went? Or someone else will be like, I don't know about that, but what about JFK? Or what about
Yes.
right? And so it's a back doorway of getting to the pandemic, because opening a conversation with, so I don't think there was a pandemic, what do you think? We're not there yet. We're not there yet. In most circles, we're not there
But
yet.
so take me back now to 2020. You've written extensively about New York. Tell me what you observed and how you got into looking into it.
Sure. Well, I didn't really start looking into the mass casualty event of spring 2020 in New York till maybe 2021 or so. There was such a shock and awe campaign in 2020, and I have 2 kids. My husband was deemed an essential worker. He's in restaurants, so he's still going to work. So I was just trying to figure out what was going on. In Chicago, we have every death that is processed by the medical examiner is in a public database. So I was poring over that like you would not believe. I was never afraid of the virus, but I was trying to figure out like who is allegedly dying of this thing. But in 2021 or so, when I was looking with some other people I was in a group with at New York and looking at just the scale of the event, 27,000 extra people allegedly died in 11 weeks, most of it in 6 weeks, 10 times the number of people that died in the World Trade Center disaster in excess death. It's unbelievable. It has to be the biggest non-war casualty event in US history. And so you can see in my tweets, and when I started substacking more about it in July 2022, excuse me, I was kicked off of Twitter temporarily for about 5.5 months. You can see me just going through in an inquiring mind wants to know fashion, like what happened here, everyone, and trying to probe and dig into data and request data from different agencies and entities. And I have to tell you that when I started out, I didn't really think, oh, this might be fabricated or, in part fabricated or a manipulated event. But a couple years later, it was impossible to ignore and to deny. So, and now I think that data sets around the world are probably manipulated, almost certainly New York City, and then Bergamo, Italy. That's another just incredible event that's unprecedented, that is not corroborated by on the ground evidence. And I'm not buying it. I just don't buy it.
Would you mind unpacking that a bit more, the New York data?
What makes it so incredible? What makes it so incredible is that, actually, like everywhere in the world, you have nothing going on in any time series data of any kind. So not just death, the number of deaths that are happening each day, but 911 calls, ambulance dispatches, anything having to do with emergency department visits. Everything is normal. Then, all of a sudden, President Trump says 15 days to slow the spread, and you see the data really near synchronously, every kind of data shoot up. The deaths go from, I think, about 125 to 130 a day to day after day after day of 1,000 plus deaths. It's incredible. All places or settings of death rise pretty near simultaneously. All ancestry groups rise pretty near simultaneously. All age groups rise pretty near simultaneously. And it's just not what you would expect, or what we were led to expect would happen with a spreading virus. And this analogy isn't mine. It's my colleague Jonathan Engler's that he came up with from looking at similar data in northern Italy and Lombardy. And you would expect a spreading disease to build sort of like a forest fire. If somebody left a barbecue on, or somebody lit a match, on one tree, you would expect to see signs or smoke signals, if you will, in the data building up. Instead, what we see is something like a bomb. Actually, not just one bomb, but repeated bombs going off over and over again. And in New York, too, we have something that we don't really see anywhere else. And we have a massive increase in deaths among younger groups, ages, beneath age 60 or so. In the age groups of 25 to 54 years old, deaths rose almost 200% base to peak. I mean, even for people who believe in COVID or believe that there was a new disease on the scene, that's pretty incredible. And we have no real corroboration from smartphones, right? I mean, there's a lot of people in New York with smartphones, right? We don't have video of bodies being managed. We don't have a memorial to this event. We don't have documentaries about it. The number of bodies that are purported to have been handled in hospitals is incredible, but we don't hear testimonies to that effect shortly after the event or even many years later. So it's just not adding up. And I like to contrast it with 9/11. I don't know a lot about 9/11. We don't have to get into that. That's somebody else's rabbit hole. But with 9/11, the buildings came down. Nobody denies that the buildings came down. And reportedly 2,800 people died in that event. So the number of deaths makes sense with the scale of the cataclysm, right? But then we have 10 times the number of people who died in spring 2020, most of it in 6 weeks. But we don't really have any evidence of it. So we have a lot of dogs that didn't bark. That's a simple way of putting it.
When you say there isn't any evidence of it, are those numbers corroborated with actual names of people?
Only the people who are buried on Hart Island. New York City is pretty unusual in the United States in that it has, for its public burials, so people who don't have loved ones or can't afford a private burial, all New York City residents are entitled to a burial on Hart Island. And it's unique because it's an island, right? And it's pretty hard to access. So those records, the names and some basic information of the people who are buried on Hart Island are available. That's about 1,900 people, if memory serves, and we have a total casualty event of the whole period of 38,000 people. 27,000 is excess. So there's just not enough in order to substantiate it. And New York State, New York City, they don't allow death records to be accessed via public record request. Some states do, but New York doesn't. So if you wanted to pull off a staged event, and I believe this event was staged, but if you wanted to pull off a staged event to kick off your pandemic, New York City, for a lot of reasons, but including reasons having to do with a lack of access to records, would be the place to do it, for sure.
Okay, so just as devil's advocate, are there any other loopholes in that? I mean, so for example, could they be buried elsewhere? Could they be cremated? What about the fact that maybe they didn't die? Were they just severely ill?
Sure. Well, what I question is the all-cause. I have it on a little piece of paper. I don't know if that's going to show up. We have this is January 1st, 2019, right? And so we have nothing going on. Massive rise of about 700 to 800%, and then a massive drop, and then nothing is going on for the rest of the year. So this is all deaths, all causes. It's an incredible event. So no, there is no way to get all of the names. All we have are numbers in spreadsheets, which, I have a problem with that because the government should not be allowed to privatize death records. They have every incentive to lie about death, don't they? the number, the nature, the speed. So I've written a lot about how this could have occurred data engineering wise, what we could be looking at here. We could be looking at some deaths that occurred beforehand and afterwards, and that were pushed up into the curve. We could be also looking at some fabricated deaths, like just hit some extra digits. But this is not an observed, I'm talking to the scientists here, this is not an observed event. Just because we have numbers in spreadsheets doesn't mean that those are observations or necessarily representations of death records. We would need to minimally have the death records released.
But could you could you, I mean, this is in New York City. You know exactly which hospitals are where. You could also ask them about it. What are their responses?
Sure. You mean going to the hospitals, or do you
Yes.
mean? Yeah, I could go to the hospitals. It's interesting. There were on the ground reporters and journalists at the time, sort of of the independent ilk, who went around with cameras and showed that there was nothing going on. Hospitals were not busy. I mean, the hospitals, just to give you a sense of scale, they allege that more than around 20,000 people died in the time period in hospital inpatient. That's the same number of beds that hospitals have. So think about that. They're claiming to have lost the equivalent of every bed in that time period. So yeah, you could go and ask. I have a lot of data from the public hospital system. See, a lot of these hospitals in New York City are private, so you can't get the data or certain data from them. But the public hospitals, one sort of red flag with them has been that they don't want to give me data really in 2019 or sooner. They don't want to give me the baseline data. They keep saying that it's locked in a black box and they can't access it, and they keep giving all of these excuses. So in my inquiry now that's been over a couple of years, a huge red flag has been that they don't want to release anything. I think because they know what I'm looking for is the plain fact. So
What do you think happened then? They just inflated all the numbers.
I think that's part of it. I think that they in the future, if something comes out, I think they will blame some kind of computer error. New York City hospitals were changing computer systems at that time, which are record-keeping systems, which I think was intentional. But I think they'll fall back and say, well, we were changing systems. So blah, blah, blah. I think maybe it was the data was military controlled, not just in New York, but in other places as well. You might remember the dashboards, like the Johns Hopkins University dashboard. But what people don't realize, I was actually explaining this to my daughter the other day, people don't realize that you cannot find out how many people died in Cape Town yesterday. I cannot find out how many people died in Chicago yesterday. There is no such thing as real-time death reporting. It doesn't matter what the cause is. There's always delays for a lot of different reasons. So I think, and colleagues of mine have said this too, I think part of what we saw in real time is we actually saw models that were being put out, and reality could not keep up with the models. And so we might be looking at people who died at some point, but not in that moment, not in those weeks, and certainly not because a spreading novel coronavirus dropped on a bomb on New York and some other selected places. So it's fraud, I think, no matter what, because what happened or what the government purports to have happened did not happen for the reasons that they say. But what makes my work, I think, different is that I'm saying I don't think the event happened as presented at all, right? Which doesn't mean that there wasn't excess. I do believe there was excess, but in New York, I think the toll is off in some way, shape, or form by about 4,000 to 10,000 deaths, which, that's a massive act of fraud. And if it's not, then they should be able to prove it, right? Just the basic, like, did this happen? Did the number of people that you're claiming to have died on each day actually die on those days, regardless of cause, in the places that you claim? This is very basic and should just be released automatically.
You said there was excess. What caused that?
Sure. Well, any excess that is genuine, I believe and have tried to make the case is just straight in hospitals and care homes. It's just straight up democide, where, and I'm not saying individuals committed murder, but there were policies and protocols that were put into place involving ventilators and the use of sedatives, people being neglected, people receiving too much oxygen. There's like a laundry list of things that are pretty well documented as occurring at that time. So In hospitals and care homes, it would be people can say iatrogenic if they want to. It's the treatment that caused it. What's really interesting about New York, too, is that they have an incredible home death event. Massive rise in deaths at home, most of it blamed on cardiac arrest, which is pretty crazy because
Stress.
we see it. Well, not. I'm going to say no to that. I'm going to say that cardiac arrest can of the nature and shape of the curve that it is in New York City is not stress induced, and if it is, that needs to be investigated by researchers. There were protocols put into place at the time with EMS services, where EMS services were pretty much instructed to withhold normal life-saving measures for people in cardiac arrest. So I think that's in the mix. And I think there might be some things in the mix involving drugs and fentanyl, but I'm not 100% on that. But that's something else that could trigger cardiac arrest of the nature and shape that we see in New York City. But none of it's a virus. That's for sure.
Okay, so that's the segue to my next question. Was there a pandemic?
No. And unlike some other people who say that there was or will concede that there was no pandemic, I don't think there was a pandemic by any definition, including the bogus one that the WHO came up with in 2009, because every current definition of a pandemic involves spread, or the spread of something, and usually the spread of something novel, over an area of people or over the globe. And there's just no evidence of spread or of something transmitting from person to person. And with things like the lab leak theory or, it came from China, we just had this incredible sequence of events in terms of speed, or what is purported with speed, that we had something leave a lab or labs in Wuhan, transmit from person to person, and then create mass casualty events in geopolitically strategic locations. I mean, you might remember Iran. Do you remember Iran said that they lost, or it was reported that Iran lost 12 regime officials to the coronavirus. And then we have it in Italy, and then we had it in Madrid, and then we had it in New York and New Orleans, and all these strategic places. In the meantime, the virus is allegedly coming from the West onto the United States, and we don't see a mass casualty event of huge proportions in Los Angeles or Seattle, where the first case was reported. It's incredible. So we just don't have the evidence for what the government or what the official story alleges actually occurred. I think we just have lies and lies about lies. Unfortunately.
So there was no pandemic. Was there a novel virus, though?
I don't see evidence of one. Of course, I've come to the place where I'm like, what is a virus? I mean, these are really just basic questions. I am not a scientist. But yeah, what is a virus? I've had conversations with virologists. Like, how do you know that a virus gets passed from one person to another? Like, my husband and I sleep together and have for 27 years, but we've never been sick at the same time. So if I don't get sick from him, or if I don't catch a virus from him, how can I catch it from the guy at the grocery store? And how do we know that these things transmit? And there's just not a lot of evidence for it. What we have is testing. We have the launch of testing that purports to detect these viral things, and then it creates an illusion of something spreading. But without the tests, you wouldn't have a sense that anything was going on, right? And I don't know about in Cape Town, but in Chicago, where the second case in the United States was announced, I didn't know anybody in those first 6 months of 2020 who got sick or who was getting sick. So again, our experiences contradict what we were seeing on the screen. And it's amazing how the government, I'll just use that term, they were able to create the appearance of something that really contradicted our own experiences and make people think that they were experiencing something that they weren't experiencing at all. And unless your experiences were different in 2020, we didn't have anything going on here except for what they said was going on in nursing homes and hospitals, right? But we had a lot of theatrics. There were refrigerator trucks. There was Andrew Cuomo giving a press conference every day. But meanwhile, we don't see bodies in the street. We don't see bodies.
I didn't see either.
Right. So, in some ways it is like the moon landing. I'm sorry to bring that up again, but, but that is sort of, one of the instances where you go back and you're like, did you really see what you think you saw?
But this is the thing. This is the thing, Jessica. If there was a deadly pandemic, it would have been self-evident. It wouldn't have required billboards and mass media marketing and everybody constantly telling us that there is a pandemic.
Right.
And I think that feeds into the psychology of what you're talking about, where people started believing something.
Yeah, they did. They believed the numbers on the screen. They believed, I think because people have been told and taught, at least in the United States, and certainly healthcare workers, but others too, we've been taught certain things about pandemics of the past. And we've been taught that a pandemic is coming, a pandemic is coming. We've been told pandemic ghost stories. I don't know if you know Miriam Abadi, that's her metaphor, like that people were told these things, and the pandemic planning industry told themselves those things. Do they believe it? Probably. Some of them do. But so they kept portending a pandemic. In the meantime, we had the expansion, again, at least in the US, we had the expansion of flu testing and flu surveillance programs, started surveilling coronaviruses. So what you see leading up to 2020 looks very much like this concerted effort to maybe find something that can be blamed as a pathogen, right? Something that can be staged as a new disease. And this new disease, you might remember, COVID doesn't really have any unique properties that are unique to the disease. The laundry list of symptoms is completely unremarkable, and not having symptoms is also a symptom. Did you know that? So
yes,
we
asymptomatic.
Asymptomatic and asymptomatic transmission, right? That's one of the ways that they kept people, I don't even want to say afraid. I do think people were afraid in the beginning, but really it was more about compliance and obedience. We had an emphasis here in the US. It's unbelievable to look back at now, but we had these postcards that went out to millions of homes, 15 days to slow the spread. And if you look at the postcard now, you'll see that it says, even the young and healthy are at risk. Oh, they were almost like war leaflets. It's like we were simulating a war. Like you send out these leaflets, like the keep calm, carry on, but stay home, save lives. You don't want to be responsible for killing grandma. All these things that they look curiously like a chemical attack drill to me in retrospect. The putting up of the field hospitals. Did you have that in South Africa? They were all over the world. They weren't just, this is something I realized not too long ago, but wow, everybody was putting up field hospitals.
But they were empty.
And they were empty, but I would say that they were part of a drill. They were part of a very successful militarized drill where the world is pretending that we're going through a war against an invisible enemy, as Donald Trump and Andrew Cuomo like to call it, with these press conference updates every day. I mean, it's just amazing. But meanwhile, nothing was really going on in reality, and I think that's hard for people to reconcile. It really is hard for people to reconcile. Even in the distant past, like the Rosenau experiments or the British Common Cold Unit, all of these really decades of experiments where challenge trials, if you will, where researchers try to make people get sick from other people, but some of them by doing really crazy things or somewhat unethical things that we wouldn't do today. And they're not they're not able to do it. I think last year there was something like that with SARS-CoV-2, right, where they tried to get people sick from it, and they couldn't do it. So it really raises a lot of questions about, or has for me, about what the things called viruses are. My daughter gets kind of mad at me. She's like, you don't believe in viruses? That's so weird. Tell me, do you believe in viruses? I'm like, it's not that I don't believe in viruses. It's that I'm not sure that the things called viruses are what we've been told and sold. And I don't think they have the mechanistic properties, or that they're necessarily causes versus effects. I'm not sure they're in the air. There are people that say viruses, or the virome is everywhere and they're in the upper atmosphere, which is very different, I explained to her, from saying people don't get sick. Are you saying people don't get sick? No, I'm not saying people don't get sick. What I'm questioning is whether this thing called a virus is the cause of that illness. And isn't it convenient for, our overlords that we can't see it? There's not, a lot of evidence that these things exist, or that they pass, and then they can just make us afraid of it. It just seems like a huge cover story for other things to me. I'm sorry, but it does.
In a weird kind of correlation, it connects to the data from New York, in that the argument surrounding contagion is very much based on computer modeling. Sure.
Right. So through computer modeling, and I would say, and I'm getting into an area that I don't know a ton about, but since the advent of genomic sequencing, right, and next generation sequencing and things like that,
PCR.
PCR testing. We have these scientists finding things, and it's almost like they think that they can explore the intricacies of the human body and reconstruct something. It's like a Tower of Babel. I think they don't know what they're looking at. They underestimate the complexity of our design. they think they're seeing things that they're not seeing. And then, you have PCR tests that are very sensitive, and they're picking up these fragments of things, but whether these fragments of things are connected to illness, or how they're connected to illness, I've just realized through basic reading, they don't know. And even just basically talking to virologists, I'm like, oh yeah, they don't know. They do a lot of inferring here, but there's no real evidence for it.
But if what you're saying is true, then it means something else happened in 2020.
Right. I mean, Democide, right? Democide at minimum.
But it would mean something a lot bigger, surely. It would mean a collaboration of sorts between pharmaceutical companies, military, governments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, unlike some other people, I believe that the events of 2020 were planned and long planned. When people ask me, well, who? Who planned it? My response to that is, well, at minimum, who? The WHO. That's the front-facing entity that sounded an alarm in late 2019. They told us there was a pandemic. They put out this PCR test. At minimum, they are perpetrators, as are government and public health officials of every major country in the world that agreed that there was a pandemic and declared an emergency. So I'm not necessarily looking for, and then you have people like Bill Gates, or some private public interests, and people who've been portending a pandemic for ages and think that they can eradicate disease, right? Pharma has a lot of interests. I think they were trying to cover up things that were going on with vaccines and the flu shot. I think that has been causing problems for a long time. And ultimately, we have decades of lies about disease being protected. There's a lot at stake here. And I think maybe the COVID shot, I'm a little different in this regard too. I think it was designed to fail. I don't think it was ever set up to be a success. I think it's taken the blame for a lot of other things, and that the perpetrators would rather have the focus be on the COVID shot than a lot of other things that were going on.
Hold on. Beforehand. What do you mean designed to fail? What does that mean?
I don't think there was, let me moderate that a little bit. I don't think there was an expectation that the COVID shot was going to do anything other than serve as a proof of concept exercise and distract from the truth about 2020 and some other things that were going on. I think that, so some people say, like Mike Eden might say, that the motive was to simply launch mRNA toward digital ID. They're trying to depopulate the world or control the population. I think those things are probably in the mix. But I think part of the catalyst was covering things up. In the United States, things going on with opioids and the failure to, I won't even call it the opioid epidemic, because I think it was the government not doing what it should to control the fentanyl supply that was coming in. Like I said, decades of lies about vaccines that were causing harms in the elderly and possibly in children. So the COVID shot comes on, or we have this staged pandemic, launches this shot. They say it stops transmission. I mean, all of these things. Nobody needed a shot at all. Nobody did, because you lied about a spreading disease. But I think that they never really had any expectation for it to do much other than to serve as an excuse to launch mRNA and to distract from other things that were going on. And, they did, I think they lie about uptake data too. I don't trust the uptake data, but, Operation COVID was a success. I mean, they proved that they could use a story, numbers on a screen, and get us to obey, and that they could get a huge percentage of the population afraid enough to take an injection. I don't know anybody who took the COVID shot who wasn't afraid in some way, afraid they couldn't travel, afraid that they wouldn't be able to go to their ladies' lunch and hold their head up, afraid that their kids wouldn't be able to go back to school, afraid that they wouldn't kill their grandma. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I just think it was a huge success. And even though I support the work of so many people that are uncovering the harms, like the real physical harms that the shot did to people, I think without also calling out the fake pandemic, we're sort of still right where they want us to be, that they're okay with that. So again, that's a minority viewpoint, but that's how I see it at this point in 2025.
So in 2020, Trump was the president of the US. Do you think at the time, pre-March, he was a blockhead who was just simply played by the military, or was he actually smarter than we think?
No, Trump is not stupid. Donald Trump is not a stupid man. I think, again, in retrospect, I think Donald Trump had probably been primed to be president for a long time, or was seen as a candidate for a long time. I'm not sure that in 2016 that his victory was as surprising necessarily as some people would think. If you're thinking from a planned pandemic point of view, Donald Trump is the perfect hyper-reality pandemic TV show president. I mean, it does not get any better than Donald Trump at the podium on the White House lawn saying that Elmhurst Hospital is overwhelmed and we need to extend the shutdown another 30 days. I mean, it just doesn't get any better than him. So, how much he knows exactly, I don't know, but I do believe he was primed for it, for sure. And I think a lot of presidents and world leaders had been, probably over the past few decades, right? Primed to this idea that a pandemic was coming and they may be the president when the pandemic hits, right? And I think they're primed like that for a lot of disasters and a lot of emergencies, right? But, Donald Trump loves a war. I think that's he's great for a war from an entertainment stamp, and now he's back, and now he's back. So I don't think that's a mistake either, by the way.
I ask that because there was no pandemic, as you say. So what the hell was warp speed?
Well, I mean, warp speed advanced the development of the shot, right? I mean, is that so? What are you asking? Why did he do that?
Yeah, but he very proudly proclaimed warp speed and the beautiful
early
vaccine.
On. Yeah, early on. I think he started talking about it in January 2020. if I'm not mistaken. So again, regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, I think people can at least say, because I have a lot of family who loves Donald Trump. So I'm like, listen, can you at least say that he had been conditioned to think that he was going to save the world?
Yes.
Right? And that this was his war. This was his battle. You see in September 2019 that there's an executive order regarding the influenza vaccine, and the need for new platforms for an influenza vaccine. So I think at the very least, he was being told that there were some things he was going to need to step up and do, right? And how convenient that the virus came from China, right? I mean, it doesn't get any better than US versus China.
China.
Yeah, it's the China virus. And so, I mean, you and I were chatting before this, and you said, oh, now it's the lab leak, and Trump's embracing the lab leak. He always embraced the lab leak. He always did that. And the lab leak, wet market, that was planted from the very beginning. You go back and you look at January 2020, and the lab leak is painted as a conspiracy. It doesn't matter. All press is good press. And these dueling narratives, these two lies were launched at once, right? You have these two lies, but the real lie is there was nothing spreading. But as long as you don't question whether anything new was spreading at all, right, you're fine. You're right where you want to be. So we keep seeing this back and forth that just is ridiculous to me.
Yes, but it creates a very interesting dynamic, because if he's pushing the lab leak narrative and there was no lab leak, that means something else is going on, and it's not about a biological event, it's about a geopolitical event.
Sure, which it always was. I mean, I think, and I actually think that that's what pandemics have always been. They're creatures of social science, economics, politics. They're not biological realities. Can there be localized epidemics involving certain things, especially with bacteria or things that are in the water or things in the food supply? Sure, absolutely. But this idea of a global spread is just ridiculous. And if you think about it, I was saying this to somebody the other day, March 2020, what happened in March 2020, they could not have gotten that from a war, from a real war. I don't think that kind of shutdown would have happened even if China had launched missiles. I don't think we would have seen it. So they got better than a war in 2020. And I think that's what people need to realize, and they need to realize how they created the illusion of a threat. And so I think we need to not just be fighting against the mandated vaccines of any kind, but of testing. Testing is a huge part of the illusion. We saw it with SARS-1. We saw it with the swine flu hoax. I would call that another kind of staged event. And they can do it again. But even if they don't run the pandemic exercise again during your lifetime or mine, the idea that they can create these appearances of a threat and just tell you that there's a threat without having to substantiate it, I think that's sort of the scary part. I'm not hopeless, though. We can just say no. In some ways, I think we should just laugh at them. Like, no, I'm sorry. That is complete BS. You're talking about bird flu? No, I'm not buying that. We just have to reject it outright. That's the answer, because our elected and appointed officials, I mean, like here we've got Jay Bhattacharya as the NIH director now. I mean, do not depend on him. Do not depend on our RFK. When you are in the doctor's office and they say, hey, it's time for your flu shot, no. I mean, be confrontational about it. That's what it's going to take. We have to starve the beast at the individual level, but we kind of all have to do it. It's like with the masking, although not enough people did that, right? But you have to say no to the forced covering of the human face. That's the answer.
Yeah, we were talking about Trump and the beautiful vaccine in 2020, but now in his second term, he's pushing it again. With Stargate, and you've got RFK who's all over the place with vaccines. One moment he's opposed to them, next minute he supports measles vaccines and polio vaccines. What is going on?
I have no idea. And, I did vote for RFK as president because he was on the ballot in Illinois. And I said I wasn't going to vote for anyone who was in elected office in March 2020. So I did vote for him. And I do think he's promising as somebody who would be or could be willing to just blow it all up, as they say. However, he's probably made some concessions to not blow it all up. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken the position. So, you or I are never going to be in that position because we would just walk into it and be like, no more vaccines, right? And I wouldn't even care if I was fired or assassinated or whatever. But, he and somebody like Jay Bhattacharya aren't going to do it. So I think there's a problem with continuing to look at these leaders as though they are the answer. They're not. In a lot of ways, they're the problem, or they're caught up in the system. And it isn't until we say no and starve the market, because money talks, right? So stop saying yes. It's like the digital ID stuff, or when they want to scan your picture at the airport. I've said no every time. No, you may not scan the picture.
But do you think Kennedy's got a gun at his head?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know. Although I think Kennedy men would kind of be used to that idea, or the idea of dying young, at least, under bizarre circumstances. So he does seem to be very courageous. Like if I was sitting down with him, I'd be like, bro, like, what are you doing? Can we talk about like what's the end game here? I mean, but the placebo trials, right? That was announced. Oh, we're going to do placebo trials for everything. No, we need to be talking about criminal trials. Why are you talking about placebo trials when we need criminal trials? So, but I'm not depending on him. If you don't depend on these people, then you're not disappointed. It's your fellow human being in your real life that you have to try to empower and embolden as much as you can, in American Revolution style. That's where I'm coming from here, in case you can't catch that vibe.
In the US, has anybody been held accountable for anything to do with the COVID event?
No. And in fact, I want to give a shout out. I don't really know anybody who has done an actual apology for anything that's happened, except there is a superintendent of schools in Illinois. Now his name is escaping me. This is terrible, but I've done a Substack on him. But he, in 2022, wrote a formal apology to parents and students and said, I'm sorry that we made your kids mask. I'm sorry that we quarantined them. I mean, a real apology. I haven't. If there are other examples of that, I'd love for people to send them to me so that I can highlight them, using my teeny little platform. But no, and there haven't really been calls for accountability among we the people. It's very strange, but I think we're in this space where, if you got the COVID shot, you're like, okay, like I sort of bought into it. So that's why I'm not into shaming people who got the shot. I did not. But I didn't tell anybody else to get it or not, because I'm very libertarian on that front. I'll tell you not to drink a cheap red wine. I'll tell you not to get your filet mignon cooked well done. That to me is an aberration. But I'm not going to. Seriously, I mean, there are priorities. But, it's hard for me to tell you to not get a certain medical thing done. That's very difficult to me.
But this is a problem, Jessica, that I have noticed, or not a trend that I've noticed since Trump won his second term. There's a lot of kicking the can down the road because the support for Trump outweighs actually what was happening. Yeah. So if Trump says it was a lab leak, suddenly it reinforces the idea that there was a pandemic, and now a big part of his support base now believe that there was a pandemic.
Right. And he has a vested interest, right? I mean, he can't say, wait a minute, there was nothing spreading, because as you said, he ordered the vaccine. So I don't see how he can ever go back, unless there's some kind of setup where it's like, oh, the data was bad or something like that. But yeah, I think people are hoping that there's going to be some kind of accountability through Donald Trump, but he's culpable. Donald Trump, Andrew Cuomo, former governor of New York, Anthony Fauci, they're all New Yorkers, by the way, and they are all on the same page. I guarantee that they are all protecting the pandemic narrative. And so really for me, it's been so freeing. And I know Nick Hudson has said this too. when you realize there was no sudden spreading virus transmitting, it's like scales fall from your eyes. And then it's also very overwhelming, by the way. It can be very burdensome, but then you see their game. You see that what they're protecting, it doesn't really have to do with the origin of the virus. SARS-CoV-2 could be a thing, by the way, some kind of identifiable thing. That's why I focus on spread. There's something spreading that was causing a new disease, right? But they want to keep our focus on the attributes of SARS-CoV-2 and the spike, and we know it was man-made, and all of this. But then when you ask some of these people, well, how did it get from the lab to everywhere else in the world? They can't really explain it. And now there's movement toward, well, it was from the US. It's from the US's labs. It's like, oh my gosh, now we've changed the scene, right? We changed the scene of the crime, but it's the same story being told, and no one can answer where was this thing in the data before emergencies were declared and the deployment of mass testing took place. And nobody wants to answer that. RFK is not going to answer that. I'll tell you that much.
Well, no, because he also thinks it came from a lab.
Yeah. Well, he's been saying the Wuhan, where's the book? I mean, like this, sorry. And this had a lot of contributors, by the way. Okay. I mean, RFK didn't write this book, right? I think we knew what the RFK story was going to be when this came out, right? So I don't think people should be surprised. It's tough when you write a book and you don't sort of leave room for error or uncertainty. When you do this, it's a little hard to get away from, isn't it? Right? So it's just, I almost feel like I have to apologize to the rest of the world, but it's not only a U.S. operation. No. I think Germany is very culpable in a lot of things.
Actually, it was absolutely worldwide, because in 2020, firstly, it wasn't a coincidence. Our country went into lockdown in the same week as the UK, which obviously was not a coincidence. And on top of that, the language changed. Had you ever heard the term social distancing before 2020?
No, social distancing, and I would even say lockdown. I'm very opposed to the word lockdown now. I didn't used to be, but we have all these terms that were used that are not in the law. They're out, at least in the US, we have laws around the control of communicable diseases, but words like lockdown and social distancing are not in there. It's more isolation, quarantine. Those things actually require official orders. They're subject to due process. So we had this language of totalitarianism really coming in right in January 2020 with the lockdown idea, like, oh, China's locking down. Are they? Yeah, they're locking down. We might have to close our borders. People have to stay home, right? So they were keeping us apart. Because going back to the American Revolution for a second, that revolution, so they say, was planned by the colonists in taverns, right? People meeting in taverns and talking about it. They can't have, for example, your wife and me, if we both lived in the same community, they can't have us at the playground while our kids are playing, talking about what the government is doing. We cannot be sharing a pint at the local bar, well, what do you think about this? Well, what do you think about this? So they had to keep us apart because they had to keep us from talking to one another. And so then you saw everybody goes to social media. Well, they can monitor that. And they had been for a long time. They can use that. They can put bot armies out there that say, my cousin died of COVID and, they died at home, stay home, be careful. Do you see how this operation worked? It's scary, but I think if we see their game and we're just able to call the bluff on it, that's how we disempower it.
However, add a caveat, because somebody listening to this will invariably point this out. The term social distancing was used before 2020. I don't know if you saw a movie called Contagion. I had never heard of that movie until 2020, but it came out in 2012, I think, and it had big name actors in it, and it was on Netflix. So we watched it. And the hair on my arms stood up because they used the term social distancing. There was a coronavirus outbreak, and that was the same thing. It was almost the same thing as what happened in 2020. And somehow I'd never seen or heard of this movie and the term, but there it is.
Yeah. It's interesting to go back and watch. What's the other movie like that? Have you ever seen The Arrival?
I think so.
Alien one. Like, I watched that not too long ago again, and I'm like, oh look, before she encounters the aliens, they're having her take a vaccine. Or is it the hiding place? What's the other one where the aliens come and they have to be quiet? I can't remember the name of that one now. But like, you go back and you look, and there it is on a screen. There's a newspaper headline that says like New York City on lockdown.
War of the Worlds.
What? No, not War of the Worlds. I can't think of what it's called right now. But yeah, so there's all these little elements that you see, and I guess this gets into the predictive programming idea. I'm not sure it's all as programmed as some people think, but I do think that certain ideas are planted into our heads via Hollywood, and Hollywood and the government may believe these things themselves, right? And so they prime us for the impossible by showing it to us on screen. So again, New York's a great example because there's no more. New York's in every disaster film about like whether it's attacked by King Kong or a tidal wave or an asteroid. You're prepared for this idea that New York is going to be under attack, right? So I don't think we realize how much these things do influence.
I forgot to ask you earlier, Jessica, when we were talking about New York, I had a back and forth email conversation some time ago about New York, and the recipient agreed with me and said, no, there was no mass death, but there was mass sickness and there was a spike. Do you agree with that?
A spike in what?
Sickness.
In what?
Respiratory.
In the hospital data, there is some interesting patterns with the way that data are, I would say, recategorized and presented. What you don't see in the New York data, or really any data around the world, with emergency rooms is you don't see any indication that people were rushing to the emergency room because they were sick. That's true when we've interviewed people as well. There was some footage taken in mid-March 2020 of lines outside Elmhurst Hospital. Revisiting that, it looks like a lot of people were there to do required testing for work, or they had been sort of coached to line up for it. And then it was done. And then you see emergency department visits plummet and stay below baseline for the rest of the year. I think there was some recategorization of data to telehealth. I think that's in the mix. But, Jonathan Engler and Martin Neal and I recently wrote about, this idea or this contention by Sasha Latipova and some other people about, there was a poisoning. There was a poisoning in New York. We don't necessarily see evidence of that. We see the cardiac arrest event. Now, if somebody can tell me that there's a poisoning that happened in a certain way and it triggered cardiac arrest, that looks like a curve, then we can talk about it. But by and large, and not just with poisoning, but 5G, right? That's another thing people put out there. There was 5G turned on in different places around the world. And I've looked at some of the contentions around that. And the problem repeatedly is just marrying the data with reports of what was actually going on the ground in real time. But, the good news, bad news is that if there's data fraud, all things are possible.
Yes.
So everybody should be on team fraud, regardless of what they believe actually occurred. But I mean, bring me your poisoning theories. Bring them. Let's look at the data. Let's see how this played out. But I just don't have New Yorkers tell me that they knew somebody who became suddenly sick or that they became suddenly sick.
So if the WHO didn't announce anything and nothing happened, nobody would have noticed anything.
Sure. And a point I want to make about the WHO, I got this from somebody at church the other day. Like, so are you saying that all these countries decided to do the same things at the same time? Like, yes, that is what I'm telling you. And what you need to know is that a lot of things related to disease surveillance and, there's a new cause of death are already coordinated through the WHO. And they have been for a long time. So when the WHO says, hey, everyone, there's a pandemic, the countries that belong to it are like, okay, I guess there's a pandemic. Or, hey, everyone, here's a test that you can use, or the protocol for the test for this new thing. Or, hey, everyone, there's a new disease, and here's how to code for it. Everybody says yes. Right? So so nothing new, I would say, was used. It was the leveraging of existing systems that allowed for a coordinated response. And that was the clarion call in January 2020. If you go back and you look at leaders from the US or New Zealand or different countries, the call was for a coordinated response. So are you saying they coordinated? Yes. I'm saying they coordinated. We know they told us, and they're already coordinated on these things. So I tend to be real basic and front facing about these things rather than trying to find a group of individuals in a back room. Are there many back rooms? You know, where the sausage gets made, as we say in Chicago? Yes, there are. But I'm not as concerned with that as I am the front facing what we saw.
One of my favorites is when people say, yes, but I lost my sense of taste for 6 months. Well, that has to be the world's worst bioweapon.
It's right. It's a dud, A. But B, a lot of the reports, I don't know that people remember this, but a lot of the reports about losing taste and smell were really more of a 2021 thing than they were a 2020 thing. I think people have a short memory when it comes to losing taste and smell, or thinking that things smelled or tasted funny after getting sick in their previous lives. I mean, I can remember that when I was a kid. It's like you get sick and then things taste and smell funny for a while. I think people forget. I think a nocebo effect played a role, or people aggrandize their symptoms, right? I think that happens. I don't know if you know Leo Biddle, but Leo Biddle from Borneo, he works a lot, or has in the past, with primates, but he put out a really good explanation through experiments that he did around the nasal swabs themselves. It's that, you know, the nasal swabs, I'm looking at some of these batches, and I can see how there's like little shards of things on them. I'm not going to get this right, sorry, Leo, but the nasal swabs themselves could have caused this loss of taste and smell. And I have to say, I love that explanation for myself, because September 2021, my son and I were both compelled to test. We weren't sick. I got something of a cold and headache a couple days after I tested, lost taste and smell a couple weeks later. He never had any symptoms of any kind, but a few weeks later is like, I lost my sense of smell and taste. And so I think the swabs themselves could have been a culprit. Isn't that genius? That's pretty genius, isn't it? I mean, from a planning perspective, if you're on the same train as me with that one. So,
looking back at the last 5 years, Jessica, what is the moral of the story?
That's a good question. The moral of the story, I think, on one level, is to demand proof. When the government says that there's a threat, you have to make them substantiate it, because they're going to keep doing this, and they have done it in the past. And there are real threats in the world. I'm not saying that there's not, but when they tell you that something is happening, you have to say, prove it, and you can't let them declare an emergency without there actually being one. Whether it's a climate emergency, right? That's the next thing, or any other kind of emergency. We have to demand the proof, and we can't let data on a screen, or really anything on a screen, substitute for actual evidence and what we're seeing in our lives or in our day-to-day experience. And I think we're culpable, and we're living in a Truman Show still, where we are Truman, and we're also the audience, but we're also part of the stage management crew, right? We're creating this beast. Where did Donald Trump come from? And I'm not exactly anti-Donald Trump, so don't take this the wrong way. Donald Trump is us. Donald Trump is us. So we only have ourselves to blame that we have this hyper reality TV show president. And I could say that for a lot of other world leaders as well, but it's a representation of us. So the lesson learned is to look, inward, right? How we're culpable, and we're feeding the beast.
Jessica, how can I follow your work?
I am on Substack at woodhouse76.com. I have 2 Twitter accounts. I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter, but the main one I really tweet from, again, now is at Woodhouse. It's Wood_House76. That's the main one. So.
We don't say Twitter around these parts, Jessica.
I'm sorry, I can't. I can't. It's still Twitter is friendly. X is like X. I can't do it.
So I guess to end the conversation, Jessica.
Sorry.
Did man go to the moon?
I know. Well, women have not, and you have to ask yourselves: is the reason that they didn't send a woman is because the woman would call BS on the whole operation? Here's the other takeaway: if it aggrandizes man's ability over God's, it's probably a scam. Think about that. Is man as powerful or more powerful than God? It's not. Nope.
On that note, Jessica Hockett, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.